Hello. First of all, this video is going to be about a love story in celebration of the new year. But first I want to say that I'm putting out this video and it'll probably be just coming up to New Year by the time I get it uploaded. So Happy New Year, everyone. And I mean that completely without irony. I know a lot of people have had a very tough time. However, 2020 was a very important year for us all. It woke a lot of people up. It got medical facilities cooperating all over the world in a way they've never done before, except China, of course, and North Korea, perhaps. And it's made us more aware of the dangers of Chinese communism, more than any warnings by economists or the few honest journalists that still exist left in the world. So yes, when we look back on 2020, we will say that this was the year when we learnt some lessons. Well, it should be the year when we learnt some lessons. The only way it could go bad now is if we refuse to learn those lessons. But the lessons have been given. We can't say that we weren't given the opportunity. Now, that's not what I want to talk about. I'm talking about seizing opportunities, though. I want to talk about a true love story, and if there are any filmmakers watching this, I have a great idea for a script to do with it. Well, I'm not so sure I could write the script, but you could probably find somebody to do it. It's a magnificent story. It's out there, and it's a story that needs telling. Okay, so we'll start with a young man called Dale McLaughlin. Well, actually, he's not so young. He's 28. And he is a roofer by trade. Now, you may ask why I'm telling you about his profession or work qualifications. Believe me, this is an important piece of information. And this young woman here, she's called Jessica Radcliffe. So far, so good. A handsome couple who have a relationship. Mr. McLaughlin met Miss Radcliffe while he was on the Isle of Man. I presume while he was doing a roofing job there. Now, you may ask why I'm so sure that Mr. McLaughlin wasn't on the Isle of Man on holiday. But not so fast. I'm just about to tell you. You see, the Isle of Man has sealed itself off from the world to keep the COVID-19 virus out, and they have been extraordinarily successful. In the first flush of the epidemic, there was the standard lockdown, and the Isle of Man, being a cohesive community, they mostly observed the lockdown, and thereafter almost all travel from anywhere else ceased. Goods came in by container, they're still going in by container, and I think that what happened was that the delivery drivers drove their cargoes onto the ferry and then disengaged and drove away. And then the cargo was picked up on the other side when the ferry got to the port of Douglas, and then was driven to, the various stores that wanted to sell the goods. Same thing with mail by aeroplane, I presume. And in that way, they have managed to keep COVID off the island altogether. The only people allowed in were returning residents and tradespeople or business people who had a legitimate reason for being on the island to work. And even then, whoever they were, residents, relatives, tradespeople, it didn't matter. Upon arrival on the island, they had to go straight into isolation for 2 weeks and then, I think, take a test to determine they were healthy, or at least free of COVID. In that way, the people on the Isle of Man at this moment of making the video walk about town without masks, have big parties, and go to the cinema and restaurants unmasked and completely freely, for all the world as if nothing is happening. I remember when I was working at the BBC how my fellow writers, knowing I had a family connection to the aforementioned island, would make jokes about the Isle of Man being in a different time zone and you had to adjust your watch 50 years back when you went there. I'll bet there are a few of those people now who'd be glad of getting back even a year by going to the Isle of Man. However, I digress. I understand the stringency of the rules. I think they're a good idea. I think it's lovely that there's a part of the world where there's no lockdown and no fear of crowds or, people just associating. And I understand why the Manx government is very strong and firm in its determination to keep the situation the way it is. I don't criticise anyone in the Manx government or the Manx police for enforcing this protective bubble. And I know Mr. McLaughlin did do wrong. On the other hand, let's just say you've got to have a heart as well. Let's get back to Mr. McLaughlin. He was on the Isle of Man doing, I suppose, this roofing job. And when the job had finished, he was then compelled to go back to his native Scotland. So far as Mr. McLaughlin was concerned, that was a problem because while he was on the island, he'd met a woman called Jessica Radcliffe, and he fell for her. And at this point, I think the situation calls for the comment that when a roofer falls, he falls big time. In fact, he fell for her so hard that he could not stay in Scotland apart from his girlfriend. And he cooked up a plan to get back to see her for Christmas. First of all, I want to show you a map. These are the British Isles. And here's the Isle of Man, right in the middle of the Irish Sea between Cumbria and Northern Ireland. And that there in the top of the picture, that's Scotland. And here we have a little town called Whithorn. I'm assuming it's pronounced Whithorn, but you never can tell with British pronunciation. So if I made a mistake, I apologise to the people of Whithorn. And according to an online programme called Free Map Tools, Whithorn is 26.25 miles from the town of Ramsey on the Isle of Man. 26.25 as the seagull flies. And Mr. McLaughlin was so desperate to see his Jessica that he got himself a jet ski and set off from Whithorn over the sea to Ramsey. Now, seeing as he'd never been in a jet ski before, he assumed that the journey would take him about half an hour. When half an hour had gone by and he was still at sea, literally, he carried on. When he was 1 hour out, still apparently unconcerned about running out of fuel, he continued. When I'd have to say many a man would have turned back to the safety of the Scottish shore because it was slow going. 2 hours later and he was still less than halfway there. 4.5 hours later, he made land at Ramsey. And then, did he get a bus? Did he hitch a lift? No, because I suppose he didn't want to be discovered. What he did was he walked. He walked 15 miles from Ramsey to Douglas, where Miss Radcliffe lives. I don't know what route he took. I could see 2 roads there, but I can tell you, because I know that terrain pretty well, it's not an easy walk. The Isle of Man happens to be a particularly hilly part of the world. Once upon a time, millions of years ago, the island was a hell of exploding volcanoes. Now, apparently, it is a heaven of exploding passions. This is what the BBC website has to say. Prosecutors said the 28-year-old bought the vehicle and set off on the journey of about 25 miles, which he had expected to take 40 minutes. After he arrived in Ramsey at about 1 o'clock in the afternoon, he walked another 15 miles to his girlfriend's home in Douglas, who believed he'd been on the island working. That's what he says he told her. Now, honestly, I don't think she thought that. But of course, that would have implicated her as well. So again, he was being a gentleman. The following afternoon, he gave a police officer her address as his own, and that evening they went to 2 nightclubs. You see, as I said, they could do that. Following identification checks, police arrested him on Sunday evening. In mitigation, the 28-year-old's defence advocate said he suffered from depression and was not coping with being unable to see his partner. Sentencing him, Deputy High Bailiff Christopher Arrowsmith. Arrowsmith. Aerosmith, now there's a band. You know, they were called Aerosmith to begin with, but the American pronunciation, they kept on calling it Aerosmith, and so finally they gave in and changed their name. Anyway, Christopher Arrowsmith said McLaughlin had made a deliberate and intentional attempt to circumnavigate the border restrictions, potentially putting the community at risk. He might, I mean, yes, but I believe from another comment that Jessica Radcliffe made, he had actually isolated himself in Scotland for 2 weeks before he set out. I don't know how much credence you can give to that. He said the carefully planned journey had also put the 28-year-old at very real risk of harm. It had indeed. Okay, now, and then there's another BBC article about the incident. Here we are. The arrival of a man who travelled from Scotland to the Isle of Man was caught on camera, so that's the picture. Now, the reason I'm reading this to you is because of Howard Quayle. Howard Quayle is the chief minister. By the way, I believe that even though Mr. Arrowsmith was annoyed with Mr. McLaughlin for doing what he did, he was definitely being very lenient, because it's I think I read that it was a 4-month prison sentence or £10,000 fine for doing what, contravening the rules. And they gave him 4 weeks, and they sent him home after 2 weeks. That is just to, they found 2 weeks in jail would be enough to discover whether he was ill or not. So they could have been worse. But even so, this is what Howard Quayle said. The 4-week sentence sent a strong signal to potential lawbreakers. Well, yes, it does that. McLaughlin had shown a flagrant disregard for the island's coronavirus laws. And then they talk about the fact that there's so much freedom of movement on the island. That's reasonable. Mr. Quayle said he was astonished by McLaughlin's incredibly reckless, dangerous endeavour. Oh, Mr. Quayle, please. He didn't do the right thing, but astonished at a man going through, well, maybe not hell, but certainly high water for his girlfriend. That shouldn't be astonishing. That's something remarkable and much to be admired. Astonished by his incredibly reckless, dangerous adventure, which could have led to others being called upon to risk their lives in a search and rescue operation. That's true. But then there are many lone sailors on the Isle of Man. People go lobster potting. Apparently there are many lobster pots around the island. People go out in small boats, laying the lobster pots and bringing them in. It's a maritime island. there are lots of people who are in positions where they could be calling upon others to risk their lives looking for them lost at sea. He said the 28-year-old had been aware of the law and showed a flagrant disregard by mixing in the community and potentially putting lives at risk. Yes, but, Mr. Quayle, apparently Mr. McLaughlin has been deported now and has also been served with an order not to come back to the island. That's not right. That's not right, Mr. Quayle. I think what the island should do is tell Mr. McLaughlin he can come back and he can stay here for his 2 weeks isolation, and then he has to marry Miss Radcliffe straight away as soon as he gets out of jail. And that would be a fine end to a really romantic story.